Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those of you who are listening from a different time zone, or good evening. My name is Ingrid Siden-Valjegaard. I'm a project director in the Global Maritime Forum. So I'm very pleased to welcome the speakers and everyone listening into this press or this launch event. We'll be launching the report Climate Action in Shipping, Progress Towards Shipping's 2030 Breakthrough. This report has been written by Katharine Palmer from the High-Level Climate Champions and Domagoj Baresic from UMass. But as you can see here on the screen, it's a range of partners who have been involved in making this report possible. So Lloyd's Register, the Getting to Zero Coalition with many of its members, and the two partners, so the Global Maritime Forum and the World Economic Forum, as well as the Mission Possible Partnership. And we're very pleased to be able to launch this report here today, because today is the day before the opening of the Global Maritime Forum's annual summit, where we will have more than 200 maritime leaders gathering here in New York at the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. So the findings of this report will have the chance to inform the discussions at that gathering, and I hope more broadly also here at Climate Week. So what we will do today is we'll hear a presentation by Katharine and Domagoj, and after that we will have two industry speakers. So we have Philippa Charlton, who is Chief Marketing Officer from Lloyd's Register, and Rasmus Bach-Nielsen, who is Global Head of Fuel Decarbonization at Trafigura. And after that, it will be open for questions from the press. So those of you who are here in the room, you can just ask for a microphone and ask your questions directly to the speakers. And those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can type your questions and we will read them to the presenter. So just remember to write who you would like to ask your question to. So with that, I am happy to hand over to you, Katharine.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Ingrid for the introduction. So my name's Katharine Palmer. I'm the shipping lead at the UN High-Level Climate Champions team. And our role as climate champions is to mobilise non-state actors and connect the work of governments with the many voluntary and collaborative actions that are taken by non-state actors such as cities, regions, businesses and investors. So about 3/4 of global emissions are now covered by a net zero goal, and corporate commitments alone under the UN-backed global campaign, The Race to Zero, now cover 15% of the global economy and nearly $10 trillion in revenue. So to catalyse action and give us greater clarity on the pathway to halving emissions by 2030, across the global economy, the UN High-Level Climate Champions launched what is called the 2030 Breakthroughs. And so what that means is that by 2030, we have a breakthrough goal by sector, of which then becomes kind of the tipping point of which we need to rapidly scale in order to be able to achieve the net zero goals. And so for the shipping sector, what that means is that we need to have zero-emission vessels entering the water by 2030 in order to achieve a 1.5 aligned decarbonisation. And together with UMass and the Getting to Zero Coalition, we quantified this goal and quantified that as being 5% of international shipping fuels and 15% of domestic shipping fuels are zero emission, and that needs to be achieved by 2030. And that's what we call the 2030 Breakthrough Goal. And so what this requires is a full system transformation across a range of different levers and a range of different actors. So when we look at this system transformation, we look at the different levers being technology and supply, civil society action, finance, demand, and policy. And then we look at the different actors in this landscape, whether they be industry, national or international actors. But in order to understand the actions that everybody needs to take, we've needed to bring this down to near-term project-level actions and launched an action plan last year that describes the tangible collective actions that are required across the ecosystem. And this report is the first of its kind, which provides that honest stocktake of progress to date. And I hope that this is a way to allow us to continue to monitor the progress of the shipping sector transition to zero. And by tracking what key actors need to do, by when and where, we should be able to accelerate pace to ensure that we remain on a 1.5 aligned trajectory. So what we found by doing this report is over the past 2 years, there has been significant progress towards this 2030 goal in terms of alignment with all actors across the value chain, uniting behind the common goal. And foundations have been laid, but where we are is we're at a crossroads where we do need more effort, and that is needed on all fronts in order to convert these commitments and pledges into actions and solutions. It's no longer a question about which direction we're going in, but it's a question of how fast we're going to get there. So this marks a significant milestone on the road to COP27. It provides a signal of a true shift to delivery that is needed, and that needs to be inclusive of all non-state and state actors in order to drive the real change that is needed. But this is not going to be possible without radical collaboration, international cooperation, and coordinated efforts across the entire maritime value chain, and through recognising the value of public-private partnerships that work together to drive forward the transformation that is needed on all levels. The 5% 2030 breakthrough for international shipping is the floor, it's not the ceiling. And if we don't take early action now to make deep cuts in emissions this decade, the transition will be more disruptive and expensive. But what is clear is that the shipping industry is intent on taking a leading role in the just, healthy and resilient transition to a zero carbon world. And what is also clear is we must continue to monitor and track our progress towards this and see this report as the first signal to strengthen collaboration, accelerate pace, and convert commitments to actions. So I'll now hand over to Domagoj from UMass, who will highlight the key findings of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharine, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. I think that really leads us into the actual report, so if we can just go to the second slide, please. The importance here is really to understand where we are and where we have to be. And so my name is Domagoj Baresic. I'm a consultant with UMass and also research associate at University College London. So what the slide here shows is just a summary of the progress that has been made by different change levers. And as a first step of this process, just a bit of a background how we came up with these change levers. So this is based on our appreciation of what Katharine explained. Where do we have to be by 2030 with respect to the fuel mix that we are on this decarbonization trajectory? And we came up with this 5% figure, but then the idea is how do we actually reach that 5% figure based on different actions? And the understanding from our conceptual framework here is this appreciation of an S-curve fuel adoption strategy, where we start off with different phases of a transition, different phases from an initial emergence phase where different R&D policy mechanisms, investments are put in place that then we can have a rapid scale-up of production of fuels. And understanding that through the methodology we developed through our conceptual framework we developed as part of UCL, and then applying it here, we tried coming up with these change levers and how they work. And now the idea here in the information we gathered was gathered through a combination of desk-based research where we really looked at the news reports, the quantitative information and the qualitative information that's currently available for all of these change levers, but then also combining it with a workshop we had with the Getting to Zero Coalition earlier this year in June in Copenhagen, where we really tried asking the tough questions about, well, how do we reach 5% to a set of stakeholders in shipping, senior stakeholders in shipping, and trying to take their thoughts on board to actually further develop this report as well. So that's where the data comes from. And then moving on from the data, we really come to this idea of how do we evaluate the data and what does this tell us about progress. So as Katharine mentioned, we're a year into the action plan. We're a year into understanding where we have to be by 2030. But it's not just about where we have to be by 2030. It's also about where we have to be today, in 2025, and where we want to be in 2050. And understanding this trajectory is important through all of these different areas. So overall, we're saying we're partially on track. What does that mean? What does that yellow light actually mean? Well, it means that we have these actions. We have these actions that we need to reach. They are underpinned by many different commitments, but in many areas, these commitments have to go a step further to actually materialize into concrete actions. So starting off from technology and supply, really understanding what production, what R&D mechanisms, what facilities we need to have in place to have rapid scale-up of production of scalable zero-emission fuels and the ships that will use those fuels. We see a lot of positives. We see a lot of R&D. We see a lot of projects, over 200 projects, pilot and demonstration projects with scalable zero-emission fuels to this date. This is an incredible achievement. In addition to that, we also see a lot of progress in safety procedures, a lot of progress on fuel cell technology as well, for hydrogen, for example, ammonia-ready ships being developed or planned. But at the same time, we're not really there when it comes to how do we convert this to the actual commitment to create those production facilities, not just for R&D purposes, but also for the rapid scale-up of production. And this is somewhere where we really need to see more effort. And I guess a similar story can be told from finance. In finance, when we talk about mechanisms for financing of scalable zero-emission fuels, both infrastructure and ships, whether that's climate bonds, whether that's subsidies, whether that's different types of ship finance. Again, we can see significant commitments. We can see increased in areas such as the Clydeback Declaration or growing commitments such as the Poseidon Principles, which to this date represent over 50% of shipping debt finance. And this is a point which will likely only continue on growing and shows us the level of work that has already been done. But now, how do we convert those commitments to actual funding? And specifically funding for scalable zero-emission fuel bunkering and production infrastructure, an area where we as UMass have analyzed and appreciate the scale of investment is significant, and seeing how that significant investment can be made in the next 5 years and then going up to 2030 is important at this day. So actually seeing that money being commitment to those investments is something that we want to see a bit more of. That leads us into policy. And I think in policy, for any of you that have been covering or following what's been happening at the Marine Environment Protection Committee meetings at the International Maritime Organization, we can see significant progress again in the last year. We can see the IMO really appreciating more than ever before the need to actually amongst many member states, the need to actually have a certain price on carbon, whether that's direct or indirect, but have a carbon pricing view of the world. We have an appreciation that the revised IMO greenhouse gas strategy is going in the right direction. But how do we convert that into the actual midterm measures necessary, into the whether it's a levy, whether it's a tax, whether it's a market-based mechanism or a fuel standard that can actually lead us to where we have to be in 2030 and then beyond. So that's where we want to see more progress. On a domestic level, towards the 15% goal that Katharine mentioned, again, we see progress, but only in a few member states of the IMO, only in countries in certain geographies. But it has to be more of a global effort to decarbonize domestic shipping, and also a coordinated effort, something that we would like to see more of, and that unfortunately at this stage it is lacking slightly behind. But again, positive signals. And then from a demand perspective, and this is somewhere where really builds to this supply side, because one doesn't really go without the other. Demand, we're really talking about freight purchases, about industry, about commitments to actually buy that zero carbon freight, so that those ship owners who are actually investing in those ships have something that they can actually point towards as a general market, as a niche market that grows, that develops, and it becomes from a nascent market to a growing market by 2030. And this is where the SCAM comes into plan, because 5% is not just 5%. It's a growing market that becomes sustainable, viable, that can grow to 20%, 30%, and hopefully to full decarbonization in the future. And we have seen progress in the First Mover Coalition with really appreciation for the necessity for a shift to zero carbon or zero emission fuels. We have seen developments with COSEV and Sea Cargo Charter to really understand the commitments towards zero carbon freight. But then at the same time, we have also seen almost a dozen green corridors being announced for shipping. What we want to see now is those corridors, those commitments actually turning into a significant value and production chain for shipping, where all of these parts of the system are actually developing those ships, developing those production pathways, developing the regulations necessary to link those ports together and to create those green corridors. And that's something where in the next few years progress is necessary to actually take us from partially on track to fully on track. And then finally, from a civil society perspective, and again, a lot of significant progress in the way that we engage with communities, where different NGOs work with communities, where they work through the IMO, through industry, through policy, to actually make shipping more visible, and the effect that shipping has on the environment, both positive and sometimes not as positive, visible to everyone around. So there has been a real appreciation. For example, the Just Transition Maritime Task Force was set up at COP26 to research some of these issues, and there has been a real appreciation of a growing awareness of the effect of shipping on climate change and on other environmental issues. We have seen the IMO being represented by more groups, such as the Inuit Circumpolar Council last year joining as an observer status. We have seen more such groups joining. We have seen more NGOs, more commitments being done through the IMO and through other sources to actually enhance this debate. Yet at the same time, what we feel is most of this has been in the global north, and we want to see more of the global south being represented in these debates. Small island developing states, least developed countries, countries that really feel that effect of climate change, but that perhaps don't really have the voice that's necessary, because once that revenue, whatever it is, and once those policies are in place, they will also be affected by it. So to see how their voice can be represented there in a way that's not just as it is now, but stronger and more open is really important, and that's where we want to see more progress happening. And finally, at a local level, where you actually see what's happening in the port, how can local ports and local communities benefit and improve shipping, it's really important to see. So that's why we also feel, even though it's more on track than some of the other areas that we saw, we still put it only as partially on track, because we want to see that progress, and want to see that progress grow quickly, so that once we are at 2030, we are at a minimum of 5% scalable zero-emission fuels. Thank you.
So, good morning, good afternoon. Lovely to be with you all today, and how fabulous to hear words like progress and breakthrough being talked about today. Let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Philippa Charlton, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Lloyd's Register, and I'm also responsible for a joint initiative between LR and our owners, Lloyd's Register Foundation, of the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub. So as I said earlier, fantastic to hear the words progress and breakthrough. And indeed, I can hear background noise from someone. That's okay. Delighted that LR have contributed to the first of the kind document research we've talked about today. Is that me? Sorry, I thought I could hear something. Don't worry, it's fine. That's fine. As a member of Getting to Zero Coalition, Lloyd's Register is dedicated to the development and deployment of commercially viable and technically feasible deep-sea zero-emission vessels by 2030, with the goal of full decarbonisation by 2050. So, of course, we're very proud to support this milestone study that will provide an honest stocktake of shipping's progress to date on the road to COP27, and highlights indeed where coordinated effort and of course collaboration is needed. So why is this so important to drive near-term action? And this really brings me to the question of why do we need the study now? Why is action needed now and over the next few years so important? The evidence, of course, is clear that the 2020s are the decade of change for shipping's decarbonisation. We need to know when and how, through this type of research, through landing specific goals and time deadlines, what action and what resources are needed to support this critical journey. because transforming global shipping is a critical part of reaching the Paris Agreement target and limiting global warming to 1.5%, building zero-emission, just, equitable and resilient global supply chains that billions of people rely on. The report identifies 3 stages of energy transition: emergence, diffusion and reconfiguration. The target for 5% of propulsion energy from zero carbon fuels by 2030 for international shipping is a critical tipping point in the global energy transition, as it is the moment when we move from the emergent phase to the diffusion phase. And this means that the industry will move from testing and development of a wide range of options to actually focusing in on the growth of solutions that have already shown results and can be deployed at scale, the criticality of that word, scalability. To reach the diffusion phase, we need the emergent phase to be successful and have to put in all of the foundations for growth by 2030. Over the next 7 years, shipping must have delivered the initial system changes by pulling on all 5 of the levers that we've talked about today: technology, policy, finance, demand, and of course, civil society. However, we cannot reach the tipping point in a single step. The actions and initiatives identified in the Go to Zero report are a multitude of steps on the journey. Each one makes its own contribution by removing a barrier, creating an incentive, or reducing uncertainty. Every positive step by a first mover, even if it's small, leads to further positive steps. There are many commitments already made by stakeholders from across the shipping ecosystem, such as the Clydebank Declaration and the various green corridors, are an excellent start. But to make these commitments real, they must be affirmed and they must be mobilised. Shipping is a highly interdependent system where stakeholders take signals from one another, and just let me give you a couple of examples of that. Cargo owners showing demand for zero-emission fuels through paying a premium give ship owners the confidence to invest in new builds and retrofits. This then leads to new construction decisions that create alternative fuel demand signals, which drives investments by energy companies. If we are able to present a clear business case for zero-emission shipping, investments by the industry will naturally flow, which of course in turn leads to new regulation that cements this progress and encourages many more companies across the maritime supply chain to participate in shipping's decarbonisation. In addition, we hope that regulatory action to create a level playing field in zero carbon fuel take-up will further increase confidence and attract further investment from other industry stakeholders, particularly those involved in building the infrastructure to scale up production and bunkering of zero carbon fuels. Another important catalyst for change to us is flagship projects. Flagship projects often attract the interest, of course, of other stakeholders and can play an important role in convincing investors and politicians and a range of relevant industry stakeholders and, of course, the public in the long-term viability of proposed fuel pathways to decarbonisation. A great example of this is the Silk Alliance, a multi-stakeholder coalition initiated by the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonisation Hub to develop a fleet and fuel transition strategy and establish a green corridor cluster within the intra-Asia container trade. But clearly there is no one-size-fits-all fuel solution to zero carbon shipping. We must take a whole systemic approach, not only considering the ship and the crew, but the ship-shore interface, trading patterns, societal expectations, technology readiness, and of course, commercial viability. Examining the fuel transition for shipping across the entire supply chain enables us to identify the benefits and manage any unknowns. Coupled with this is the fact that investments have the best chance of success if based on a system solution. Together, we believe these actions will create virtuous circles, unleashing the forces of change in our industry and providing solid foundations for the energy transition to grow in the next decade towards our 2050 goal for full decarbonisation. Lloyd's Register is very proud to play our part. Through our work with the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub, we're committed to creating safe, sustainable pathways to a zero-carbon maritime industry and building these partnerships with the critical stakeholders to develop these evidence-based reports that we've talked about today. the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub has developed a decision-making tool called the Zero Carbon Fuel Monitor to bring together evidence of progress and identify the gaps that must be addressed. It provides a deeper and comprehensive understanding of the readiness of zero carbon fuels for shipping as they stand today and is available online. By its nature, decarbonisation of shipping requires deep structural change, and it is important for us to keep a pulse on shipping's key indicators in decarbonisation to reach the rates of change essential for 5% zero carbon fuels by 2030. To close, what is the most pertinent issue is the need to ensure the conversion of interests and principles into actions. And this report allows us this focus, the focus on resources and actions on areas where we're lagging. For this, and all the hard work that's gone into this report, I sincerely thank the authors for putting together this vital waypoint on where we are in shipping's decarbonisation journey.
Okay, so I will move on. My name is Rasmus Bak-Nielsen, and I'm the Global Head of Fuel Decarbonization from Trafigura. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those listening in. It's a pleasure to be here today. Before we look ahead, I will allow myself to look back. And 2 years back, there was literally nothing happening in the shipping space. And if we go to this page on slide 2, if you had made this 2 years ago, it would be all red, completely. So I think we have to appreciate, as an industry, how fast and how much has happened. I've personally lived through it, a lot of people have lived through it. January 2021, Scandinavian Climate Ambassador, who was previously part of an IMO delegation, said, market-based measures will never happen in the IMO. It was discussed in 2013, 2014, it was turned down. And 4 months later, the Prime Minister of this country invited our CEO to a roundtable. 4 months of transitioning, and this is sort of a good example of how fast things are happening. Change is happening. Let's just take a moment to sort of appreciate what's going on also today, because today is a small step among many. And I think the report, which is incredibly well drafted, I really appreciated reading it, and I very much look forward to seeing what comes afterwards. A lot of strong independent organizations are behind it, and well done to you, Katharine and Dominic. What we need in the industry is sort of a framework tool to establish where we are, and the report does that incredibly well. And that's why I think this report can manifest itself as a valuable tool for measuring our industry's progress. If again I look back for the 2 years which has passed, we have seen a lot of skepticism among IMO nations. We've seen a lot of skepticism. However, skepticism has been transitioned into optimism, and we have seen and felt a mindset change which is more or less historical. And I say that seeing that 11 months after this Scandinavian Climate Ambassador said market-based measures are impossible within the IMO, an IMO nation came out with proposals. It was followed up earlier this year with another proposal. So what we've seen is that IMO is actually there to take responsibility, or I should say certain countries within IMO are there to take responsibility. The challenge that we all have, and we have a lot of good intentions as an industry to transition, but the challenge that we have, we don't have the sustainable zero emission fuels available at scale. And in order to transition, we do need these. Certain companies are investing large money, significant money, into FEED studies of green fuels. I give one example. A company has invested 20 million euros into a project not knowing if there is a market for these fuels. Not all companies can do that, and there is a limit to how much this can be done. But in order to transition the industry to a 5% transition by 2030, we need the market to drive the transition. And in order to have this market, we need sustainable zero-emission fuels cost neutralized. And herein lies a big responsibility within the IMO, because it is the IMO which can govern and regulate this. So I'm optimistic in the sense that IMO is moving forward. However, we should not underestimate the importance where we are today, which leads into the next IMO meeting, which is we need certainty that decisions will come on carbon pricing. Without this, we cannot expect to reach the 5% target by 2030. In such case, the IMO would be letting down the shipping industry. And the transition and the progress that we've seen in the last 2 years, also driven by the Global Maritime Forum and the various organizations also behind this report, is the fact that there's a whole industry which is behind it, who wants and who needs the transition. So, IMO, it's up to you to take action, and we need you. Looking forward beyond that, looking at the 5 points which the report works about, we have zero concerns about finance. As long as you have the market mechanisms there, the fuels will become available and the banks will be there. There's talks about that the industry needs $1 trillion plus to transition, trillions I should say, depending on who you ask. We are not 2 seconds in doubt that those funds will be available from renewable investment funds. We see institutional American investors coming in oversubscribing renewable funds. So the funds are there, but we need the market to drive the demand. In terms of the shipping industry and having access to hydrogen-derived fuels, we are in a market which also will face challenges. And it will face challenges in the sense that other industries are currently moving faster than the shipping industry. It means that other industries may go and offtake the hydrogen that is to be used to convert hydrogen to green methanol or green ammonia. So if we don't have immediate action and clarity on forward pricing and cost neutralization of the sustainable zero-emission fuels, the shipping industry as a whole risk not having access to these fuels, which would be a devastating fact. So I can only say that we need action and clarity, and with that I am very optimistic and hopeful that we can move and transition in the pace that the report describes. Again, I think today we have to appreciate that the report is a great step forward, and I think it will be used as a benchmarking tool for future progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for really excellent presentation and interventions. Now it's time for questions from the floor or for participants from YouTube. So, yes.
Hi, my name is James Deneen. I am a reporter with New Scientist magazine. This report is about measuring progress, and it does it in a somewhat qualitative way. But there's a sense in which the only measure of progress that really matters is the amount of emissions from global shipping and also the amount of zero emissions fuel being used. So can you put a number to those two things now? How much zero emissions fuel is currently being used in shipping, and how have total emissions changed over the past few years?
I can give that my answer, and then we can see if anyone else has a different answer. So from the perspective of how much scalable zero emission fuels are used, and in this report we generally talk about hydrogen-derived fuels, that's very, very small. That's very small. Even when we take battery electric power into consideration, it's in certain niche markets. You could call it, from an emissions perspective, somewhat negligible at the moment. But that's the thing. That's why we're doing this report, to show where we have to be at 2030. And that's why the qualitative aspect there is to actually appreciate what actually has to happen to lead us to that 5% figure. Because all of these actions, as we mentioned previously, are taking place in all of these other areas, and further actions are needed to actually take us there. Appreciating that we actually have to be at that level, at that 5%. Having said that, a lot of domestic issues, a lot of domestic case studies show you that battery electric ferries have really taken off in some countries, especially in Northern Europe, and it shows you that the level of this transition can be rapid if the necessary financial mechanisms, policy mechanisms, and technological mechanisms are in place. That leads us to a second point, something that Katharine mentioned at the beginning, from the perspective of emissions. The emissions for shipping are continuing to increase at trajectory. That's because the global trade has been recovering ever since COVID. We will see what happens now with the current geopolitical situation, but we expect emissions to continue on increasing as long as we do not convert or transition away to these scalable zero-emission fuels.
So I'm currently the voice of Julian Bray from TradeWinds, who's asking a question on the chat, and that's for you, Rasmus. He's asking, will the energy crisis fallout from the Ukraine war hinder the momentum for change and hold up IMO carbon pricing?
I don't think IMO has any excuse to stop the policy making. That's the first reply. The second reply about the green transition. And I'm on the board of a company which is trying to build the biggest electrolyzer, 1 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity in Denmark. And we have been deeply in with politicians in Denmark over the last 12 months. And we've seen a real change in the mindset and leading politicians up to prime minister level. The green transition is happening. I think Putin has pushed it at least 5 years forward, if not 10. The way that we see the whole hydrogen pipeline infrastructure talks and action being developed in Denmark, but which leads on to Europe and other countries, I'm very convinced that Putin has pushed this 5 to 10 years forward. And we will see a tremendous amount of green electricity unlocked by the North Sea and the Baltics in the coming 12 to 24 months, which would otherwise not have materialized.
So not hindering, but actually speeding up?
For sure. I'm convinced. And it's at least 5 years, and I see that from personal experience, from having spent a lot of time with politicians in Denmark, amongst others.
Okay. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room?
What sort of synergies are there between decarbonizing global shipping and decarbonizing other industries? I was interested because you mentioned potential competition between shipping moving too slowly and having its hydrogen taken by something else. Can you speak to that versus potential synergies there?
Well, synergies is because we're in competition. The shipping industry is in competition for the hydrogen with a whole range of industries, whether it being the steel industry in Europe or refinery industry, data centers, heavy duty infrastructure, trucks, etc. So we're in competition with a lot of industries for the hydrogen. The synergies, investors are there and they will come in scale. But in terms of a direct synergy, I think it's more competition, to be honest. Yeah.
I would probably add to that in the sense that, you know, we've spoken about the ramping up of green hydrogen, and many markets are going to need that green hydrogen. But, you know, shipping is a good quality first mover market. That actually, as production capacity is ramping up, you know, shipping can be that driver to provide that longer term security on investment needs to ramp up that capacity. So as we're in low capacity of green hydrogen at the moment, if that goes into the shipping market to start with, the shipping market can provide that long-term offtake agreement to the hydrogen producer that gives them a little bit more security to get more investment to ramp up capacity. And then you have excess capacity that can go into other markets. So I think I would look at it in the sense that shipping can be that first mover market of where the hydrogen that is being produced today can go into that market first, that then provides more certainty and security for hydrogen production to ramp up capacity. So, and I think many, you know, when we look across the hydrogen landscape, you know, many of the hydrogen producers see that potential, that the shipping is that first mover market. And so that's how I would sort of look at it, that shipping can help decarbonize other sectors by being that first mover.
And just to add and to correct myself slightly, technology cost will be driven down by creating large hydrogen markets, and this is for production of electrolyzer capacity, which is in the process of having a technology change and ramp up. So there is actually, on the technology side, a big synergy in that sense, which I should have mentioned before.
Yeah, so you're done?
Can I do one more?
Yeah.
Yeah. What percentage of emissions that the shipping industry is responsible for are captured by the countries and companies that have made the types of commitments you're talking about? I guess another way of asking that is who is left out of the progress that you're talking about here, whether specific countries, regions, sectors within shipping?
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, well, and drawing a little bit on your previous question around the amount of emissions and the amount of zero carbon fuel in the market at the moment and this need for quantitative data, I would say that where we are at the moment in our transition, very early stages, so this is a starting point, and where I would like to see this go is that, you know, as we start to get more uptake of scalable zero emission fuels into the market, as we start to be able to get more granular data that is available on country, I guess kind of domestic emissions plans and those kind of things, we would start to see this report becoming much more quantitative. Whereas at the moment, it's, you know, we can sort of say, you know, 42 countries have committed to the zero emission shipping declaration. But because we don't necessarily have, you know, what proportion of those international shipping emissions are assigned to that country, it's very difficult to be able to quantify that. But I think we could evolve in time, but I think as a starting point, this sets out what needs to be done by when, by whom, in order to create the conditions that are needed to increase the uptake of zero emission scalable fuels, of which then we can start to be able to say, you know, when we do this again in 2023 or 2025, we might say, you know, there's X amount of tons are green hydrogen, X amount of tons are green methanol, but I don't think we could do that from day one.
And that's why I think we talk about it being a report, but it's not a one-off. It's an iterative process. You've now set those parameters in place that we can check on a more regular basis. I think you said the next one, 2023. So we can start to land, and that landscape's going to change. So some of the examples you've just brought up maybe need to be measured in 5-10 years, but we don't have that information yet. But
related to that, are there people who would disagree with the decarbonization strategy that this report takes, like starting with ramping up zero emissions fuels? Are there is there a completely different approach to decarbonizing shipping, or is this the strategy that there's consensus on?
There is one, and I think the report mentions that as well. It's optimizing vessel efficiency, whether it's a mewis dock, whether it's a sail on board the deck, on those ship types where it's feasible. Those things are feasible for certain ship types, and that will happen more and more. But when that is done, there's no other option away from what is fossil into what is green. So this is what's going to take the big step forward for shipping's decarbonization path and trajectory.
What about nuclear propulsion? People talk about it a lot, but there's no such thing as a molten salt reactor in actual operation anywhere, is there?
On large-scale shipping, no.
I mean, people are talking about it for shipping, but I think it's still in.
It is coming forward.
Yeah.
It is the technology which could become, which is very hard to say today. Yeah. Companies are investing significant money into it. We see that. Hard to judge when, if that will materialize. Yeah. But it's a good question.
But I think, you know, you've mentioned the word strategy. I don't think this report is setting out a strategy. It's setting out, you know, a set of actions that need to be taken across the maritime ecosystem by different actors, by different timescales to enable, to achieve the strategy, and that strategy. I just think that we've got to look at it as, it's providing a stock take of progress. Where is climate action happening in the sector? Is it happening in, are we doing more in certain areas and not enough? When we look at all these enabling conditions that need to come together to be able to create the system change that is needed, we can start to say, maybe we're not doing enough in certain places and we're doing more in other places, or we're not doing enough in all of them. And I think its intention, is really to be able to provide an action plan of which actors can coalesce around, provides that direction, and helps identify where do we need more international cooperation, where do we need more collaboration, where do we need to put more effort. And so it's providing that kind of signal and that stock take of what is needed and when. And I don't know the frequency of this going forward, but I think it needs to be continuous, because we've got to keep checking in to sort of see, is action being taken, or are we going to say, like in 12 months' time, there's been no additional action based on this report. And I think, that's really what I would see. This isn't a one-off. This isn't a kind of, it's a point in time that says this much action has happened since we launched an action plan that was based on previous work that UMass and the Getting to Zero Coalition has done around that transition strategy. So that transition strategy is there. This provides an action plan to deliver that strategy, and this is now just providing that stock take of progress that helps monitor and assess, where do we need to strengthen some of our work. And that's how I would kind of look at it. It's not providing a technical solution. It's not saying here's the technology pathway that needs to be taken. But what it is saying that, we need scalable zero emission fuels by 5% by 2030. And what do we mean by scalable? It's going to be, what is that long run intent solution? It's not something that can only be used in a short period of time and then we have to go through another transition to something else. So it's just sort of defining what we mean by scalable zero emission fuels.
With that, I think you got the last word, Katharine. We're out of time. So thank you so much to all the speakers, and thank you for all the good questions. And yeah, have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.